you for your patience. We're a few minutes late in starting, and I know there's a few more people to come, but we wanted to get started. My name's Gillian Robinson. I'm director of ARK, which is a joint University of Ulster, Queen's University organisation committed to opening up access to social and political information. I'm actually wearing two hats today because this seminar has been run as part of the ARK seminar series, but I'm also one of the researchers involved in the research that will be being reported. But what I want to do is to welcome you all to this seminar. The research which we'll be reporting today was first launched in the media in September, and we've had a number of events, so it's great for us to see that there's still people there who maybe haven't had a chance to attend some of the other events, or who come from different areas of life that weren't included in those earlier invitations. So it's very nice to see a range of people here from a range of different backgrounds with an interest in this topic. So the format for today is that I'm going to say a little bit about the methodology which the research used, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Jonny Byrne, who'll talk something about the findings. Our colleague Dr. Cathy Gormley-Heenan is unable to be with us today from Social Policy at the University of Ulster, but she sends her best wishes and apologies that she wasn't able to be here. Jonny's a lecturer in the School of Criminology, Politics and Social Policy at the Jordanstown campus of the university, and I'm based at INCOR, the International Conflict Research Institute at the McGee campus of the University of Ulster. So that's the research team. The format is then that we'll talk in total for about half an hour, and then you'll have an opportunity to make comments or ask questions or contribute anything that you want to the debate. And that's a really important part of the ARK seminar series every day, but particularly important today because we are still working on the outputs from this research, and we have yet to produce a policy brief. So it may be that some of your thoughts, comments, questions will help feed into that policy brief, which will then go on forward to government, and I know there's some government representatives here as well. But your comments will be taken on board, and we welcome comments, observations or whatever. Then after the official presentation, a light lunch will be served at the back, and you're welcome to stay on, have some lunch and talk to us further about the research if you want, or talk to each other about the research. Okay. I should say the seminar is being recorded because we put the seminars up on the ARK website for people who aren't able maybe to join us. Okay. So, unusually for academic research, this research commenced in March of this year, and it's quite tight turnaround to get work like this done and into the public domain by September. So it's been a fast process. And it originated, Jonny will say more, but it originated really in other work that Jonny's been doing over a number of years, particularly around his PhD thesis, around interface areas, around peace walls, and qualitative work looking at the issues there. During the course of his work, Cathy was one of his supervisors, they felt that we really need to know something about wider public attitudes towards peace walls. Not just the people who are living right beside them and in the neighbouring areas. What does the wider public think? And indeed, what does the wider community in the peace walls areas think? Not just the people who are perhaps the community leaders and the people who are very active. What does the regular residents think, and what are their views and opinions? So we applied to OFM-DFM for some funding to do a public attitude survey of the general public across Northern Ireland, and also a targeted sample of people living close to peace walls. And we were successful in that application, and our thanks to OFM-DFM for that support. The survey went to the field. It was a postal survey in March and April 2012. We did the preliminary analysis then in June, got the draft report to OFM-DFM in June, and published it in September. We've had a number of community workshops. We've had a presentation to statutory bodies in October. This is a public seminar today, and we also be doing an assembly briefing later this month. And as I say, we want to produce a policy brief. So it's been a very tight time scale and turnaround on this project. I think it's important to be very clear at the beginning. The report is called Attitudes to Peace Walls, Public Attitudes to Peace Walls, and that's the term we all use when we're talking about this. But in the questionnaires that we designed, we actually used the term peace line because we weren't just interested in physical mortar walls, we were interested in any barriers between communities. And so we said in the questionnaire we're using the term peace line to cover all kinds of interface barriers that keep communities apart, including walls, gates and security barriers. So as I've already alluded to, there were 2 postal surveys, one of the general population and one of the Peace Walls residents. They were random samples of the general population, and then we focused in on the Peace Walls area, selected the streets, 2 to 3 streets back on each side, and sampled within that to get the Peace Walls residents. So it wasn't a door-to-door sample, we weren't going around just handing them out, it was actually selected from the pointer database. There was a £10 voucher incentive to try to encourage people to take part, and indeed some people took that voucher, but many people chose to make a donation to charity, which was a very nice side product of the study, in that I think about £8,000 went to 2 charities, Northern Ireland Action for Cancer and the PIPS Suicide Prevention Charity. 2 separate but similar questionnaires were developed, and they covered a range of questions, but broadly we were interested in, and this is the 2 samples, the general population and the peace line residents, how close people live to a peace line and their opinions on the area as a place to live. People's understandings of why peace lines were put up in the first place, and it's nearly 50 years since the first one was put up. So why do people think peace lines were established? What was the impact of peace lines on the area and more widely in Northern Ireland? At the moment, many of you will be aware that there are policy initiatives and debates going on around peace lines. We wanted to know if the general public and indeed the residents in the areas were aware of the policy initiatives. You know, how much did they know, if anything? Who did they think was responsible for peace lines? Who did they think should take on what roles? And did they think that there was any way that peace lines might be transformed or removed, and what were their opinions about that and obstacles to that? So that was the questionnaires. For those of you from Belfast or Derry, just to let you know the areas that were selected, obviously we couldn't cover every single interface across Northern Ireland. So it was broken down into 4 areas: North, West and East Belfast, and then Derry, Londonderry. And in North Belfast, Hazelwood, Whitewell, Ligoniel, Ardoyne, Glenbryn, Old Park, Cliftonville, Tigers Bay, New Lodge were the areas. Lots of seats at the front if you want to come up. West Belfast, the Upper Springfield, Fallshankill, Suffolk and Lenadoon. In East Belfast, the Short Strand and Inner East. And in Derry, Londonderry, the Fountain Bishop Street interface, Tully Alley, Cullinearan, and Top of the Hill and Irish Street. Just technically to let you know that for a postal survey, we were very pleased with the response rate. Peace Lines area total response rate was 26%, which was quite good. So we had 840 people living in Peace Lines areas responding to the survey. That varied across the different areas, but nowhere was below 23%. And the rest of Northern Ireland, which I think was really staggering, the response rate was even higher at 32%, because when we were designing this, people said, nobody else will be a bit bothered about it. Nobody else in Northern Ireland is going to be interested in peace walls. It only affects the people who live near them. But in fact, nearly a third of the people who we sent questionnaires out to were bothered enough to respond. So a good response rate for a postal survey, and I'll hand over to Jonny now, who'll talk to you about some of the key findings.
Good afternoon, you're all very welcome. Gillian's outlined the technical stuff around the survey, which was completely alien to me, and this is probably the first time I've really participated in a research project that's involved statistics. I spent most of my life trying to run away from stats because they scared me to death. And I suppose one of the first lessons from this research is how much power somebody has in the message that they put out there in relation to statistics, and how they interpret them can have a massive impact on how the story is picked up. You know, when we launched this research, the Irish News front page was 68% of residents don't want peace walls down, and I was very disheartened at that at the beginning, because to me that's not how I interpret the statistics. I thought they were more positive than that. And so I suppose I have a degree of power here in the stats that I've pulled out from the survey. And so, again, a note of caution, these are just my interpretations of what I found interesting, along with my colleagues, in relation to the stats. You can make your own mind up in how you read the statistics, because from the outset, you'll notice that the stats, there's a number of paradoxes within the statistics, and to me that makes it more genuine a survey, in the sense that I think people really did take their time in filling it out, because some questions they've responded in a particular way, and then 3 or 4 questions later they've responded maybe differently to the initial question that they looked at. And to me, I think that's when people were filling this out, maybe this is me being optimistic, but people sort of interpret each question at that particular time, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a few minutes. The survey, I think, told us these 6 key points about people's understanding and knowledge of peace walls, the roles and responsibilities in relation to peace walls, in relation to processes, initiatives, about examining them, the general public's and local residents' awareness of policies, initiatives around peace wall transformation. We then asked people to think about a future without peace walls, and then what that would require from a community's perspective. And then finally, we looked at this imagining question, imagine what if. So those are the 6 key areas I'm going to try and cover now. And not to bore you to death with statistics, I may allude to a certain table in the report. I'll ask you to look at it in that sense. Before I just touch on the impact of peace walls, one of the first questions we asked the residents was, because I think to understand where we go in relation to peace walls in the future, we need to understand what people think about them now. How do they interpret them? How do they understand their existence? And I suppose, regardless of whether your religious background or where you lived, the number one reason for the existence of peace walls was around safety and security. And I think that's very important to understand that. People interpreted peace walls in a sense that they were constructed to provide safety and security. Okay, so that was underpinning people's views about why the first one was built in 1969 and why we've got up to 80, 90 peace walls, segregation barriers in the city. So there was this underpinning view of security and safety, and I think we need to be conscious about that around any conversation we have in relation to going forward. But in relation to the impact of the peace walls on local residents, the top 2 stand out in relation to those that lived closest to the walls felt that they were still necessary because of the potential for violence, and that they made people feel safer. Okay, so when people were asked about the impact of peace walls, straight away the number one concern was around safety and around protection. Okay, and that's in the sense of physical safety. So there's over 3/4 of residents felt that the peace walls make them feel safer, those that lived 1, 2 or 3 streets away from them. Okay, in the context of looking at it from a policy perspective, 67% felt that they did send out a bad image of Northern Ireland, okay, in relation to where we are 10, 14 years after the beginning of a peace and political process. And ironically, 53% of them seen them as a tourist attraction, okay? Those that live closest to the peace walls, more likely to see tourist buses, to see black taxi cabs, etc., so they were more likely to see them as a tourist attraction. When we asked the general population about peace walls, the 2 statistics that really stood out was a sense that the majority felt that they sent out a bad signal about Northern Ireland, but only 38% seen them as a tourist attraction, which I found quite small. I thought that figure would have been quite higher, but that's maybe because people's understanding and knowledge about peace walls, the further away they live in relation to the walls, is less than people think. Okay, so those are just 2 of the sort of standout stats in relation to the impact of the walls. We then decide to test people's understanding and knowledge about ownership of the walls in the context of policies, initiatives, practices, plans, etc. We asked local residents, who do you think should have most responsibility for the walls? And the largest figure was the local community themselves, over any government, local or at the executive level or city council or the police or any security organisations. The majority of respondents felt that the community themselves should have responsibility for any decisions about peace walls. Okay. Ironically, the organisation, the department that has responsibility for the majority of peace walls, the Department of Justice, only 4% of people identified that the Department of Justice had responsibility for them. Okay. We then moved on, after asking them about their understanding about ownership of the walls and in relation to policies around them, and asked them, are they aware of the different initiatives? You've had the stuff around Alexander Park, you've had the recent media profile about IFI funding, about Belfast City Council's funding around peace walls, motions passed in council, you've issues around Northumberland Gate, etc. So there's been a number of issues discussed in the media and at a local level about transforming peace walls and interfaces. And so we asked the local residents, were they aware of any of these initiatives? And that was one of the standout figures. Over 2/3 were unaware of any initiatives, or hardly any, knew nothing at all about any of the initiatives that are ongoing within the city. Okay, So I'll touch on the significance of that in a policy context later on. But over 2/3 were unaware of anything really. Okay. So then we asked, okay, well then who do you think should keep you informed about this? Okay, and who do you think should have responsibility for informing those that live closest to walls about policy initiatives? And this is where it gets interesting, as opposed to looking at the executive and at the sort of Martin McGuinness, Peter Robinson type figures and the executive itself. The majority of respondents felt that this should be a local initiatives with local people, local politicians, local MLAs, local councillors, local community activists, local community representatives, who should be keeping those closest to the walls informed about what was happening, okay? That may have implications about how we drive forward any implementation programmes around peace walls. But what this says to me is that they see this as a very unique issue that's very context driven, that is sort of needs to be sort of located and positioned at a very local level, okay? And the other standout statistic was around, do you want to know anything more about these initiatives? And there was a public appetite for it. Over 63% said that they were interested or very interested in finding out more. So people weren't dismissive of the fact that these initiatives are ongoing. There wasn't a sense of trepidation about, oh, we don't really want to know anything about taking down walls or transforming walls. So there was an appetite there that people were interested in taking this debate forward, which I thought was interesting. I suppose the standout question was then, we asked them, do you want the walls down? You know, we offered them a number of opportunities. The previous study was done by Trina Vargo in 2008. They focused on 6 interface communities. 60% of people at the time indicated that they would like to see peace walls down now or sometime in the future. Our survey returned 58%. Now the methodologies were very, very different, but it's the only figure that we can compare with at the minute, okay? 14% would like to see the walls come down right now, and those are residents who live right beside them. However, 44% were slightly more cautious. They were optimistic but cautious in saying that they would like to see them come down sometime in the future. A fifth of respondents were didn't like the way the things are now. That was a fifth of respondents basically felt that they didn't want the walls to come down. They were quite content with the status quo. Okay. So people sort of look at the 58% statistic to say that this is positive, that they would like to see walls come down sometime now or in the future. To me, I think the standout statistic is this last one: 9% to make subtle changes to the peace walls. You know, I think sometimes we have a tendency to fudge the issue about peace walls. You know, is it about keeping them up or is it about taking them down? People talk about regenerating interface communities, transforming interface barriers, opening gates, etc. When really, what are we trying to say? Is it about keeping them or is it about taking them down? Well, only 9% of respondents felt that transforming them aesthetically in some way to make them more accessible, but to keep the actual structure there was an option. So that to me lends support to the notion that there isn't a significant level of support there for this idea about trying to aesthetically change the surroundings but keep the segregation there. Okay, so that's just the stats in relation to removing the peace walls. And this is where sometimes you find the statistics get a little bit paradoxical. We then asked them, can you imagine a time, and this was sort of quite frustrating, I felt, and I got quite despondent in relation to these statistics. 45% of respondents who live closest to walls cannot imagine a time when there are no peace walls in Belfast. Whereas only 38% can. And to me that sends out a signal that people cannot imagine, they don't understand what a city without walls actually looks like, or they actually believe that the structures in place at the minute, the current processes that we have, are not going to lend itself to an outcome that results in no peace walls. And I'm, at a personal level, of the opinion that people simply can't imagine what it looks like not to have Cooper Way peace wall, or a division between Ardoyne and Glenbryn, New Lodge, Tigers Bay. It's very hard for people to actually imagine what that looks like and what that means to them at a very personal level. And that's something I'll come back on at the end. We then sort of said, okay, so we are going to take walls down, hypothetically. What does that mean? What are the implications for that? And 37% felt that there would be violence during particular events and dates. Violence around parades, football matches, commemorative events, etc. Okay, so there was a direct correlation between those types of cultural celebrations and issues around identity and relationships to violence and safety. And I'll touch on that again at the end as well. And also then, in relation to that, 58% were fairly or very worried about the police's ability to provide safety if the peace walls were removed. Interestingly, there was very little difference between Catholic and Protestant respondents in relation to this, but there was a deep sense of anxiousness within respondents about the ability of the PSNI to provide protection and safety if the barriers were taken down. So in exploring in more detail what that actually means about taking down peace walls, okay? So if we want to get to, if our vision is the removal of peace walls and a space where there are no physical lines of demarcation, what does it entail? And we broke it down to two key areas: community safety and security, and engagement. And this is where I find the results start to get slightly interesting from a community perspective. The two key standout characteristics of this question in relation to preparation, which is in Table 18, are community safety, security, and engagement. And what we found was distinctive differences between Catholic and Protestant respondents in relation to these two key areas. In the context of community safety and security, 56, so the majority of respondents felt that CCTV and 46% more policing were necessary to create the conditions for the removal of peace walls. Whenever we broke those down by religion, we then noticed that there were significant differences between Catholic and Protestant respondents, whereas the Protestant community were more inclined to support increased CCTV and increased policing, whereas the Catholic community were less inclined. So you can see the differences in the statistics there. So, and this has implications in relation to policy and implementing policy in relation to addressing a community's fears and needs. Okay, so clearly within the Protestant community, there's a greater onus in policing and CCTV and security, as opposed to within the Catholic community. Then when you move on to engagement as a prerequisite to addressing the needs to create the conditions for the removal of peace walls, you find that there's distinctive differences between the Catholic and Protestant community. Local community leaders working together, opportunities for bringing people together, and local politicians working together. So this notion of engagement and this notion of relationship building and creating a positive atmosphere between community representatives, activists and leaders is what is required to create the conditions. But again, there was distinctive differences where the Catholic community seemed to put a stronger focus on engagement than the Protestant community in relation to community leaders, providing opportunities for bringing the different communities together, and local politicians not so much working together. This notion where the two communities could create the conditions themselves, the onus seemed to be more on within the Catholic community and the Protestant community. Okay, and at the end, I'll try and make some sense of that and what that means for implementing policies. Okay, but just the two key areas, community safety and engagement, are the underlying characteristics of creating the conditions. But then, whenever you break that down to Catholic and Protestant areas, there are distinctive differences in what that looks like. We then just touched on the wider impact of this, and this is again, Table 19 is quite disconcerting as well, in the sense that we asked residents themselves, do you know what, if nothing happened, if we kept the status quo the way it is, what would happen? And I felt worryingly 51 to 67% against all those responses in relation to the economy, employment, community safety, good relations, investment opportunities, creating businesses, etc. The key characteristics of what we would look for to build a very good and homogeneous society. The majority of people felt that nothing would change, it would just stay the same. Now, whether or not that has implications for that, if things aren't going to get any worse, then what's the point in doing anything to make it better? Which sometimes is the case when you're making policy. You need to get to the point where it becomes imperative that you do respond to the issues. But this has implications, I think, in building relationships across the communities. But local residents beside the walls felt that the status quo would just remain the same. And this would not have significant implications for employment and for investment opportunities in businesses. Okay. One of the questions then we asked in relation to the general population was these three areas, because whenever I was doing a PhD, I was of the opinion that only people living closest to walls really cared about this, and that this wasn't something that the rest of Northern Ireland could be bothered about or really had any views on. And the only time that this would become an issue is that if you were taking funds away from a school in Enniskillen to put it into taking down a peace wall in West Belfast. I actually felt that was the only time that this would resonate across Northern Ireland as a whole. But I was wrong from the survey results. The majority, 51%, slim majority, felt that the issues surrounding peace walls were important for everyone in society. So they felt that whatever happened to peace walls did have ramifications across Northern Ireland as a whole. And also that 78%, so 3/4 of people surveyed, felt that segregation of communities was common in Northern Ireland even where there were no peace walls. Okay? So segregation was a significant issue. So we all knew that, but then it's just got the evidence, the stats to back that up. And finally, which I thought interesting, was 2/3 felt that peace walls should be a big priority for the government. Okay, which I felt supports work going on in the executive, that this is a big issue that has implications across Northern Ireland as a whole. The stats seem to back up that idea. So what do all these statistics mean? We've got this research. What are we going to do with it? I think there's a number of key points. I think one of the key areas is consultation. What does consultation look like? You can develop all these processes, these initiatives, these policy programmes, these funding drives, and there are a number going on. Belfast City Council, IFI, you've got the Social Investment Fund, you've got CRC's core funding programmes, you've got a number of programmes ongoing that are addressing issues around interfaces. But clearly the evidence suggests that those living closest to them are unaware of what's happening on the ground, of what these processes actually look like and what the implications are. So I think there are serious questions there in relation to how we consult with local communities and what that looks like and what form that takes and what we're actually consulting communities on. I think that there's still a lack of clarity about what our end product is. Are we looking for a city without walls? Are we looking for a city where issues around education, regeneration, housing are addressed? I think that there's a degree of ambiguity about what all this will look like, and I think that needs to be sort of addressed within the consultation process. There is an appetite for information where the stats clearly show that the local communities, those living closest to walls, are keen to find out more about what we're talking about. 66% are keen to participate in debate, to learn more about these initiatives and programmes. So I think that whatever form consultation takes place, it will be met positively. We highlighted these four as necessary in creating the conditions for removing peace walls: policing, security, engagement, and imagination. Policing, which has already been alluded to, is a key area of concern around if the walls, as we've already alluded to, provide a sense of security and safety, how do you reciprocate that if the walls aren't there? Policing is a key issue. And security and engagement. Security and engagement at a community level, across communities and within communities, is very important. And then finally, imagination. And I think this is the key for me. I think that we still haven't created a mechanism where people can imagine what we're talking about, what this actually looks like. What does Belfast look like without walls and barriers? And what do we mean by a city without walls and barriers? And my fear with this is that for years we've associated at times education, lack of investment, violence and disorder with peace walls. I think the reality is if the peace walls are taken down tomorrow, you're still going to have lack of social investment, high rates of unemployment, poor educational attainment, issues around mental health, issues around prescribed medication, alcohol, issues around violence and disorder. So taking the walls down isn't going to solve the ills of society, especially within some of the most economically and socially deprived communities in Belfast. And I think that we need to get a degree of clarity about what we mean by that, that if we take the walls down, we aren't automatically going to have a magic wand that's going to address everybody's problems. And I think that needs to be tied in with this notion of what we're talking about. And finally, these underlying needs and concerns about protecting culture, securing identity, and instilling a sense of community. Can I ask you to go to figure 2 in the report? And I'm quite conscious about what I'm saying here at this stage in relation to figure 2, and again this is open to interpretation. We looked at the impact of taking down peace walls from a Catholic Protestant perspective. Page 14 it's on. And we asked residents, what does this mean? And I think that if you're looking at a policy initiatives about taking down peace walls or transforming interfaces, then you need to know how do you sell it, for want of a better word, in communities? How do you actually tell communities that this is a good thing? And figure 2 to me has massive ramifications about any processes that are moving forward. There are significant differences within the Protestant and Catholic community in relation to culture, identity and sense of community and what the peace walls themselves represent and what they actually mean. And there is a deep concern there within the Protestant community about the removal of peace walls and the implications that has for their community and what that represents. And that sets aside changing demographics within the Protestant Catholic community. We'll know more when the census data comes out for Belfast. It hasn't been released yet for some strange reason, but it'll be interesting to see what the different council wards look like in relation to Catholic or Protestant demographics. But there are implications there around protecting culture, securing identity, instilling a sense of community in relation to having a conversation about removing peace walls, because we talk about a fear in the context of physical security, but obviously that means more within certain communities, within certain areas, within certain districts. The sense of fear as in a community disappearing. There is evidence across Belfast of previous areas which were Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist, have now become just Catholic, Republican. There's no evidence of it being the other way around. So if we take down peace walls, what does that mean for the community themselves, and what are the implications for how they they express themselves, celebrate their culture and identity, and feel secure in the knowledge that they are not under threat as a community itself. So those are implications, I think, at a policy level in relation to taking forward any ideas about removing peace walls. Very briefly, we've done a couple of seminars with different groups. I've had a number of interviews and conversations with people on the ground in relation to the findings themselves, and I just wanted to share some of these with you in relation to what people are saying about the data so far, especially those that are working on the interfaces who are working on these issues on a daily basis. And these are just some of the comments that have come out. Transforming research into policy, this is not a new area. People are, especially on the ground, are sick to death of research studies around interfaces and around peace walls, and so they should be. You know, I'm as bad as that as the next person. You know, there's been so much research done in this area. There's been so many people have been interviewed, have been surveyed, have been asked their views and opinions. But you know what? How do we drive that into real policy change on the ground? How do we make tangible differences? Okay, so that's one of the first things that has come out. Also, this notion about perception versus reality. If one of the reasons that peace walls exist is to provide security and to reduce violence and disorder, there are a number of peace walls in Belfast and interfaces where there has been no incidents of violence and disorder for the last 2 or 3 years. There have been no incidents of stone throwing. There's been no incidents of exchanges between youths. There's been no incidents of people being attacked, all down to policing and to community relationships across the interfaces. So when does no violence become the point that it is no longer a reason for the peace wall in the first place? Okay, so there's this argument, when is it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 months, 6 years, that whenever the absence of violence no longer becomes a prelude for keeping a peace wall. Okay, so that's another thing that's come out. Also, as I said before, the survey is a complete mixed bag. You know, if you read the survey results, you sort of question how they were filled out, but I actually think that it makes it more genuine. I think that people actually did sit down and read each question carefully and answered it truthfully, because it really is a completely complex issue, and it's so you may want peace walls down now, you may not want peace walls down now, but you may be filling this out with your daughter beside you or your son beside you, and the next question asks, would you like to see peace walls down in the future? You may look at them and go, actually, yeah, maybe in the future I would like to see them down. I'd like to see a city where we don't have peace walls. So that may be as an example of how they fill this out. I don't know, but I genuinely believe that the fact that they're so contradictory makes them more genuine. This notion about changing the conversation. The peace wall sits within the Department of Justice. It's framed within the community safety. The majority of the issues around peace walls are framed within a community safety perspective. People have said it's time to change the conversation. This isn't simply about security. It's about good relations. It's about employment. It's about education. The peace walls need to be framed within such a way that they encompass a multitude of issues. And simply to place it within a security framework does the other issues an injustice and hampers the conversation. Again, concerns about the PS9 and the policing of these areas. Okay, it's come up time and time again in interviews with respondents and with community workers about how do we replicate the safety that the peace wall engineers itself within communities and transcend that into policing. Overexposure and underachievement. Again, community activists, interface workers, this whole notion that they have been overexposed to these ideas. This is not new. People know these issues, but yet there's been no tangible differences within the community to show that what we do works. Okay, people can't point to physical examples of making a difference at a policy level. This notion of black, white and shades of grey basically is my way of looking at this as a completely complex area, and what works in New Lodge won't work in Glenbryn maybe, and what works in Glenbryn won't work in the Falls, and what works in the Falls won't work in Short Strand. And it's just this idea that we need to be very careful about what we're talking about here, that maybe we're looking at generic principles, but we need to be conscious that each area is very unique. Each area has got very different legacy issues about the conflict. Each area has got very different issues about the personalities that operate. Each area is working in a different capacity. Each peace line is very different, and we need to be conscious about that when we're talking about what this means in real policy terms. And also, what may be successful in our down Glenbryn may look like failure in New Lodge, or what is successful in New Lodge Tigers Bay may look like failure in Fallshankill. And so we need to be conscious about what we're actually trying to say here. You know, a community may transform their peace wall into a gate. That might be success for them. That might be all they want at that stage. And just because they don't take it down doesn't mean that it's a failure. And vice versa, you may find that an initiative doesn't work, but communities are closer together, maybe that is successful. So I just think we need to be clear about what we're trying to say here in the sense of what vision we're looking at. And finally, there's a multitude of interventions, targets, deadlines. There's a concern among the communities that we have a number of initiatives, that there's a degree of momentum about funding here. There's a lot of goodwill about this, but there's a lot of deadlines, targets, okay? Taking down peace walls, taking down peace lines, funding finishing in 2013, 2015. And there's a concern that putting these deadlines and targets on it may hamper the actual building of momentum. So finally, I'm pleased to hear the degree of positivity around the subject. I think there is, like, as I said, when I read the Irish News headline, 68% of people don't want peace lines down, I was like, it was seriously, like, I didn't think that reflected the true responses within the survey, and I think that you need to read them to understand that there's a sense of positivity I take from the survey results. It's no longer considered a taboo area. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but whenever I started my PhD in 2008, I was doing interviews on peace walls with people, and we talked about everything about taking down a peace wall, because we couldn't talk about taking down a peace wall because by talking about a peace wall, you're automatically predetermining that the wall should come down, because a peace wall should not exist in any normal society. So there was this fear about talking about peace walls, because rightly so, I think people believe that there were underlying agendas, that any conversation about a peace wall would lead to its removal or wanting it to be removed. But I don't think that's the case now. I may stand corrected, but I think it's no longer a taboo area. I think that people are confident to talk about peace walls and peace lines. Whether it's to keep them, whether it's to take them down, whether it's to transform them, I don't know. But I think that it's an area now that we can talk about, that we can accept as part of our fabric, it's part of our makeup, and it's something that exists, that is here today. So, and I think a few years ago, people were reluctant to even talk about it. So I think that that's progress. The public want to know, there's a degree of positivity around an appetite, that the public want to know about initiatives and programmes and processes, that they want to find out more about what's happening on the ground. They may not agree, they may agree, I don't know, but they're willing to listen. My concern is how we disseminate the information. How do we actually target the people along peace walls, peace lines, about these programmes and initiatives? And I know there's a number of people in this room who are doing a number of pieces of good work, and I don't doubt that for a minute. I'm just looking at the broader perception over Belfast, that we need to look at how we disseminate what we're talking about. I think we need to be conscious again about the issues around the cultural and social community concerns, whether it's about bonfires, flags, parades, whether it's about expressing our culture and identity in a safe and secure way, which is shifting the whole conversation away from peace walls itself. But clearly the results show that there are those within communities that feel that their sense of identity, their sense of community is a threat if we take down a peace wall. And that's the fact that exists from the survey. That needs to be considered whenever we're talking about addressing this issue. How do we get to the stage where one community does not feel threatened by the existence of another community, either culturally, socially, economically, or physically? And finally then, measuring, quantifying and imagining success. And I've said before, is this about taking them down? Is it about putting gates in? Is it about transforming the interface physically or aesthetically? I don't know. That's for you to decide, for communities to decide themselves. But I think that we need to know what we're talking about. I think we need to know how we actually quantify it and measure it, so that we get to the stage in 3 or 4 years' time, and we can say, actually, we've had all this money, we've had all this goodwill, we've had all this energy. This is what we've got to show for it. And we need to be confident enough to say that maybe we haven't taken down 50, 60, 40, 30 peace walls, but we have achieved A, B, C and D. And I don't think those mechanisms are in place at the minute to say that this is what we've achieved over the next 3 or 4 years. So, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, well, thanks to Jonny, and it's a measure of the evolution of this research that, I last heard Jonny give presentation on some of the findings about a month ago, and it has moved on even since then, as he says, partly in response to the conversations and people that he's met and comments that we've had over the time. So what we'd like to do now, and the other thing is, can I just check, is there anybody from Londonderry in the audience today at all? No, because I think we fall into Belfast speak, and as I'm from Derry, the results do include a sample from Derry as well. Okay, we open the floor to comments, questions, observations, and Dirk has the mic, so if you are happy to introduce yourself and ask a question, feel free. Yeah, the back too. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jonny McClory, and I'm from an organisation called the Chronic Regeneration Initiative.
No, it doesn't magnify you, but it goes to
Okay.
the video. Sorry.
Basically, congratulations and well done to everyone concerned in putting the survey together. This is just an observation on my behalf. I work as an interface worker within inner South Belfast, and it concerns me that there are no statistics or anything at all about inner South. And inner South is an interface area. Just because we don't have peace walls, we've got a peace line, like a peace river and a peace railway line, which separates the communities. But it's just for future, if it could be included. Inner South, we have 2 nationalist and 1 unionist community there that are working very, very well together and are not getting that recognition. But when it comes down to the bottom line and us applying for funding and things like that, people ask you, you're not an interface area. So basically, for the future, and I do know that we're going to meet with the DOJ in relation to that, because South Belfast don't have any interface areas and we'll all live happily together there, which is not the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you're.
Burns Pollock from Newry, Tabor community. I find it difficult to get my head around this idea, the definition of peace wall. The British Army constructed the first peace wall, so it's a military solution. And by looking at it from your point of view, you're looking at a military solution. I can go down to near Dundalk, and there's a border. It's a virtual border. So I'm trying to get my head quite seriously around this idea of a peace wall. It's too convenient, it's too cozy. So can you sort of redefine the word? What is this wall about? It's a military solution.
It's not my place to define what it is. It's a military solution, but then you could argue from 1994 peace walls were constructed. 1969 the first one was built in Cooper Way, and then to 1994 there was no consultation process involved in the building of peace walls. From 1994 onwards there was a consultation process involving local politicians, local community activists, the RUC and the NIO. Saying from 2002 the strengthening and maintaining of peace walls was no longer constructed or administered by the military. They were done by the NIO in consultation with local communities themselves. So there's been a divergence in the response in how the walls were constructed from 1969 to 1994. There were military response. Segregation worked because it worked in that sense. But from 1994 onwards, communities took ownership of them, and to see them simply in a military framework, it's too simplistic to frame it in that way, because you're into issues around territory, you're into issues around housing, you're into issues around community, and so there's a multitude of factors that go into that. But I don't even know if that answers your question. That's okay.
I think the other thing about the border is that the border is a virtual dividing line, all right, but it's a political line. So that's a different thing again. And this study was set up to address what we know as peace walls, as in the actual physical manifestations that were first created, as Jonny said, 50 years ago. So we weren't looking at political borders and geographical borders, we were looking at barriers between communities within the one jurisdiction, I suppose. Right, Mark?
Yeah, it's just a little bit of information. They weren't.
Would you like to stand up, because it's hard to hear at the front? Thank you.
The very first peace lines, of course, or barriers were put up by the local communities themselves, you know, and in fact, what the British Army quite often did was to remove the rubble and the burnt out cars and put in their own barbed wire, you know. So to say it was a military solution may not be strictly correct. In fact, the communities had already divided the areas up amongst themselves.
Jerry.
And Robin.
My name is Jerry Reddy. I'm a local interface worker here in the Duncairn Gardens. It's just the point that I caught the earlier part. I think we need to be careful that we're not dismissive of the small pieces of work that's actually going on here at the present time. We're talking about walls here. For me, it's about the mental block. It's It's about people understanding who lives on the other side and how we intermingle. If it's about the small gains and the small victories, because as in all things, we look at things short, medium and long term. And in the short term, it's about opening the gates. It's about taking the grills down. It's about the wall in the park up there. It's the only one in Europe apparently that has a wall running right through the middle of it. It's about getting the gate in there. It's about bringing people together who walk through that gate. It's about using Duncairn Gardens for all that it is. Okay? And there's people who work here, people use this as a community base as well. So, I've just seen the start of it. It's about, for me, it's about giving people the confidence, and the only way that that's going to happen is bringing people together now. I'm not talking about we're all coming out for a giant community hug here. It's not about that. It's about sharing a space that's out there, whether it's going to be transport, whether it's going to be the schools, whatever it's going to be. But I think that people need to give a recognition in regard to the small pieces of work that's going on. And we can look out there, we can look towards North County, we can look down towards Cityside. There's one of the areas here where there was serious rioting going on there. And although there wasn't a wall, there was the invisible barrier that was down there. And people ceased going to go to the shops. And that worried us around here. So what we did, got together with the statutory bodies, the retailers down there. And what we did, we persuaded the adults to remove themselves from interfaces in regards to riots. Unfortunately, at times, there was a vacuum and young people filled it. We then had to convince them. But what we see is the positives this here. There's a major retail park down there. It's holding its own. Its only complaint to us now is there's 911 car parking spaces and it's not enough. We have people who walk across here in the mornings and go to work and come down New Lodge Road and goes to work. So I appreciate the figures, but I also think that there needs to be that wee sort of sense of hope here that things are moving on.
Jerry, I covered that at the end when you left. Because I just wanted to, because my point was we need to be careful about what each area is very different, and our vision of what we want out of this, any process, it doesn't have to be about it's about different steps in different areas, and I know 100% agree with what you're saying. So.
Robin, Dirk, Robin, here. And then there's man in the road.
Robin Wilson, well done, John. It's all very interesting stuff. I think the first thing I'd say is that we need to challenge the assumption that somehow those people who live closest to peace walls have got the responsibility, never mind the capacity, to bring them down. When you think about it, that's actually a crazy idea, because they didn't put them up in the first place, and they're the most disempowered and marginalised people in Northern Ireland, so the least likely to feel able to bring them down. The second thing I think we need to recognise is that the only other places anywhere in Europe that have anything like Northern Ireland's, quote, peace walls, unquote, and Orwell would have loved the craziness of that idea, are one or two places in Central and Eastern Europe where members of very ghettoised Roma communities have been walled off at the behest of others who don't want them in their neighbourhood. What we have to do is get, at the political level, an agreement that this is fundamentally unacceptable in a civilised society. That not only should people not be recruiting support on the basis of sectarianism, but it is fundamentally morally beyond the pale to have a society where you have walls like this. And obviously that's a big challenge we have to make. The second challenge goes to the police. Because people who can get rid of these walls very quickly are the police service in Northern Ireland. The police service in Northern Ireland have huge resources by comparison with police services across the water. They can mobilise huge numbers for parades whenever they want to. It beggars belief to think that they cannot mobilise the necessary numbers progressively to bring down walls one at a time to ensure that people can be guaranteed security as the walls come down. It simply beggars belief. And the problem, of course, is that disadvantaged working class people in North and West Belfast aren't the highest priority for the police. Sorry, a second. Anywhere else in Europe, this would be seen as an issue of simply providing the rule of law for everybody. And as your research shows, Johnny, as every other piece of research has shown, most people want the walls to come down. Most people are fearful that if they do come down, there'll be some negative effects. It's up to the police to provide the rule of law, as is expected of them in middle class areas, by everybody who lives there, in working class areas on just the same basis. It's that simple.
There was another question just in front, Robin. We'll take two more and then come back to them in a grouping.
Thank you. Alan Erskine from a research organisation called Identity Exploration. First of all, again, congratulations on an excellent piece of work in a pretty short time scale. Two things really. One, I suppose, a reinforcement. Secondly, a question. First reinforcement really is that we've been conducting complementary research, again with some help from OFM, DFM, and our findings across two studies now have been very positive in many areas. And I think there is a tendency, particularly when we do desk research and look at the material, that there is a general level of negativity out there around progress that's being made and the initiatives that are going on. So there is positivity in the room, which is great. Our statistics would show that there's even more support for sharing, integration, removal of walls, etc. But there is a recognition that there's a difference between aspiration and the immediate future. The second thing is, in our work, we saw very significant differences between the areas. And I'm just interested in your own study. You've got quite a lot of different parts of Belfast, and indeed in a position to compare and contrast Derry, Londonderry with Belfast. Are you in a position to go down to that very local level and perhaps indicate whether there are some areas which are closer to and more ready for removal, social progress than in some other areas?
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back. We'll just take that comment and then come back to everybody all together. Can you pass the mic back, please? Thank you. Thanks very much.
John, I can ask you to respond to that question.
Thank you very much for this. Just a couple of very quick observations. We published a awareness survey earlier this year, and for the third successive 3-year period in a row, it's showing that sectarianism is still high enough. And 30% of people say they can justify prejudice in certain circumstances. That's twice the average of 3 years ago. And 33% of people say they've been prejudiced against or harassed as a result of belonging to a group. 33%. That's the reported ones. I've just come from a hate crime conference across the way with Unison, and there are 4 recorded incidents every day of sectarian harassment. Now, the reason I'm saying this is the bigger context, because I didn't live near a peace wall, although one time I did, and I find when I try to talk to people there, sometimes I'm feeling as if I'm coming as a parachute drop. And I think what Jonny said is I'm identified with those who want to remove them. I think this must be started in a bigger context of dealing with the past and imagining the future. And the letter I talks about the modern imagination. I was involved in integrated schools. 2/3 of communities from 1960 say they want shared schools. Now we have them still only 7% older. So there's something going on between statistics and reality. So it's something about how do we actually envisage a different future where peace walls as they currently exist or peace lines may be something different. But I would take a different view than Robin. I don't think it is a policing solution. I think the policing are involved with 7,500 cops and too many things, and they end up in early stuff. I think this is our responsibility as a community. But my struggle as someone who doesn't live here, Johnny, is to know what's my role, because I don't automatically want to think because I can, I want to take them all down tomorrow. So I think I'm trying to say, how do we have a sensible conversation with a what if, the one size doesn't fit all, in the context of dealing with the past. So
Okay.
thanks for this contribution for it, and I hope it does go somewhere.
Thank you.
Can I ask? You
Yeah.
go ahead.
Just can I ask, and Robin, to raise your point, can I ask John just that idea about, because I don't know, I don't think I can fairly answer that question because in that sense, but if you're, it's an interesting question. If you live on those who live closest to the walls, about having the final decision, or not having the decision, but being empowered to make the decision about it stays up or down. What? It's a complex question. It's
It is. If you believe in conflict fears, such as letter, it's about bottom-up approaches and middle-out support first. I believe communities have the competence and have the ability to be able to make the emphasis and take the emphasis and run with. I've seen it existing in practice on the ground. It's already occurring. It's about widening that out. It's about building in them processes. I don't think it's just a PSNI solution. Manufactured PSNI are on the day saying we haven't enough resources, so I think that's quite clear. I know they're wrong about a different factor that's probably a more worrying factor. But I think there's clear assertions made in this piece of research, and I think there's important assertions. There's a lot of positives. But it does make the analysis that people don't know about peace walls going down. But you acknowledge yourself, Johnny, that's quite a generic
Mhm.
kind of thing, broad brush. But there's areas in that Tigers Bay, New Lodge, Glenbrand, Ardoyne. We haven't broke the statistics down into them
Yeah.
particular dynamic communities. And within some of them communities, they may know a lot more than what the research actually suggests.
Yeah.
So on the ground, there is massive progress happening in areas.
No.
A lot to learn from in terms of practice. I think one of the things you point out, Johnny, sort of want to come back to, is people can't imagine a city without walls. Well, there's people can't imagine what it's like to live beside a wall out in society as well. And I think that's a very important factor, because what we imagine in the concepts that we're given, learn constructed concepts. It's not something that free falls out in your head. If we were asked to imagine a wall, a city with walls, and what living beside interface is, you'll already think of security, you'll already think of psychological powers, you'll already think about health, about education. Concepts that exist in the real world, we use concepts that exist in the real world. I notice in terms of the demographic profile, in the 55 to 65 age bracket, there was 18%, 20% in the 65 plus age bracket, 38%. But yet we were quite surprised with the figures of 45% couldn't imagine a city without walls. The only people that we've got as a reference point in terms of a concrete knowledge is the people in the
60 plus.
55 to 65 plus age bracket, which weren't completely covered in that sample, that can actually imagine a city without walls because they experienced it in the past. I think that's another important
Okay.
point.
Thank you. The two points just. Oh, sorry, Katie.
Yeah, just a brief congratulations on that.
Okay.
Particularly interested in your 50 Shades of Grey.
Been reading too many books.
Johnny's got the way he's reading this.
I think there's something, thank you, Michael. I think there's something
Had
in
a
there.
Freudian slipper on his right now.
Well, actually, it is actually 50 Shades of Red, White and Blue, because I think what John is saying is really important, and to follow on from what Michael has said, that there is not one homogenized response to peace walls, peace lines, interface issues, and particularly, if I may make that sweeping generalization within Protestant Unionist and Loyalist communities, where there is such a diversity of response, whether those are people who are connected to the work that's ongoing there, whether it's in terms of people who are living there, or who've perhaps been moved into areas because of the huge amount of displacement that's going on in terms of the regeneration work that's perhaps not yet going on within Protestant Unionist and Loyalist communities. There's an inordinate amount of poverty, as people have said, within those communities. And that's not just a poverty in terms of financial resources, it's in terms of a variety of different things. And so I welcome the fact that you problematize the work that you've done, and I welcome the opportunity to read more about that.
Thank you. Seriously, in response just to Michael Robbins' point, I think that, to me, in my own very personal view, is we need to get to the stage. There's two things we need to do. One is to get to the stage where one community doesn't feel a threat to the other community, and that's not just in peace walls. And one of the things that annoys me about Northern Ireland is sometimes when we talk about segregation in Northern Ireland, the first thing we do is the media will do is they'll show a picture of the Cooper Way peace wall, and there's this assumption that sectarianism and segregation is this urban working class phenomenon in Belfast or in Londonderry, and it's characterised by peace walls. But the reality is that it's not. It's a societal issue. I think that in an ideal scenario is where you get to the point where both communities see the peace wall as a hindrance to their growth and development as a community, and where the point comes, they say they question actually the peace wall is holding us back. That to me is the perfect scenario where the two communities come together and realise that if they can address the peace wall, then both of them will develop positively in what they want. But that's a bigger question than understanding like simply taking a wall down.
Could I just come back on a couple of the other points that were raised? You asked about the differences between the sub-areas and whether we'd done any analysis on that yet. We've just begun to, and we'll only be able to talk about some of the questions because the numbers to the sub-areas that have been included, and we hope to do that. The other interesting thing is that already on the website, on the ARK website, where the data is all there for you to do with what you will, to a certain extent, on the ARK website /peacewalls 2012. The age tables are already there, and you made an interesting point about only the older people can remember a life where perhaps all the walls weren't there. The other side of that debate is the community good relations debate around younger people and their perceptions and being able to imagine perhaps in a different way. And we've only begun to look at that in detail as well, but the findings aren't as straightforward as you would think, and it's not clear cut, the differences between the ages, so we haven't had time to go into detail on that. But again, the data is there, the tables are there, and maybe some of you might be able to begin to look at that as well. The other thing, Michael, your point about this being a sub-area of dealing with the past or can't be looked at on its own, I think for me, as someone who had not been directly involved in peace walls related research before, that's exactly the thing that's come out. And we didn't focus today very much on the general population's views and attitudes, it was more on the peace wall residents' views. But you know, the finding that Jonny reported that so many people in the general population see segregation as an issue, and that's one of their top findings, even though there have been questions specifically about peace walls. The fact that they allude to this bigger problem, I think, is perhaps positive in that there's a growing recognition by all of us across all parts of Northern Ireland that the segregation is a big issue. So I take that to be a finding that it's negative in that it's depressing, but it's also positive in that if we're beginning to accept that segregation is not just an issue for interfaces or not just an issue for Belfast or Derry, that may be positive and may help us in moving forward, at least with some of the debates. So I think we've gone on quite a long time. Can we take the last two questions? Can you wait to get your sandwich? Okay, last two comments.
Hold on, John. Hold on.
Mike's on its way to you.
Need to record it, John.
Oh, it's been. Okay, we've got three questions.
Okay, and I suppose I'm in danger of sounding a bit cantankerous here, Jonny, but I'm not sure how useful the survey is. And I suppose
don't be shy.
No, I'm not going to be. I think it's pretty typical of our academic and media culture where things take place within very narrow ideological boundaries, because what you're presenting here is something completely divorced from the big structural issues. I mean, you mentioned about the area. All these areas are working class areas. They're all impoverished areas. I mean, why does nobody sit up and look at the obvious what's staring them in the face? These problems don't exist. There is no interface walls in the Lisburn Road or the Malone Road. We should be asking more meaningful questions. Of course, to ask those more meaningful questions brings us to areas we're not meant to go, or ask questions that we're not meant to be asked. But it cannot be divorced from living in a society which is grotesquely unequal, and an economic system that produces people, so many people who feel hopeless. So I'm not sure. You know, we're dealing here with symptoms of big structural issues, and I'm not sure the big structural issues have been given any weight at all in research like this. I know you're maybe going to say to me that's not the purpose of the research, but you wouldn't get any funding anyway to ask the big structural questions, and it probably wouldn't be very good for your academic career either. But I just thought I would make that point.
I'll take the other two. Come back to you, Kieran.
Suppose a couple of observations. I think the research goes to the heart of the issue around the cost of division in the society as well, that we need to begin to look at. And it is no coincidence that, you know, we are sitting here in Duncairn Gardens. On that side of Duncairn Gardens, 1 in 3 people work, and on that side, less than 1 in 3, not to mention educational underachievement, which certainly has issues around mobility and connectivity within this city. But it also speaks to the fact that we really don't know one another, depending on what side of the world that you live in. One of the issues that I'd be keen to tease out is the policy response, Jonny, in terms of the recommendations that you're going to make around some of this stuff. I mean, as someone who works in this, or I'm broadly frustrated that there's a new plethora of policy interventions that are running. And I think it is more of a statement of our politics that it's the International Fund for Ireland who are leading this stuff, as distinct from the Northern Ireland Executive. So the issue is, in terms of framing a response, I think it picks up and speaks to what John Howcroft has said, and it is important to acknowledge the work that those guys have done around this field as well. But it is about that participatory bottom-up nature, which I often feel is a miss when there's policy response that's been formulated. So anything that you can speak to that involves local people and designing the policy and allocating the resources would be very, very welcome, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. You can. So last comments then, John.
I disagree with you, Kieran. So I think that, and I think that, and do you know what? It's the chicken and the egg. Does the peace wall and segregation lead to higher unemployment, poor educational attainment, issues around prescribed medication, etc., etc.? Class issues are fair enough. and if you take the peace wall down, will you start to address those issues? I don't know the answer to that question, but I don't think that you can divorce the fact that in urban working class areas there's a big 30-foot wall between two communities. And I think that if, as John says, it's an issue around mobility, if it is a sign that people aren't going to invest in those areas because of the threat or the potential or the risk of violence and disorder, if it is a hindrance to investment opportunities within those communities, then at least if we address that issue, it takes out one of the issues or justifications that people won't invest in those communities. So you could argue that, okay? That's fine.
You can argue over sandwiches.
That's fine. We'll argue over sandwiches. And John, I've forgotten what your point was. The cost. No, you're 100% right in relation to the policy response, and it ties in with, I think, on what Robin says. In an ideal scenario, you'd like to think it's CSI, and a document in that framework may provide the leadership at the macro level that gives you I think that it comes down to confidence and communities having the confidence to take the risks, because I don't think there's, at the macro level, there's that framework in place that allows communities to take the big leap forward in what you're talking about. Is that right? Does that make sense?
Well, I think communities are taking a leap forward. I think the issue is that it's not reflected in the policy discourse, and it's the disjointed nature of the policy over interventions. And I think
there is no policy.
What I want to make is, when you are formulating the recommendations around some of this stuff, there is something to be said for practicing the policy that grassroots practitioners who are involved in this stuff actually begin to shape the policy discourse on the basis of some of this research.
100%. No, I definitely 100% that there's a lot of good work going on at grassroots level that has been going on for the last 3 or 4 years. Jerry touched on the stuff around city side as an example here that gets lost at the top, that doesn't really get fed back in. So yeah, there will be using examples of that at a grassroots level to feed back into the policy narrative.
Okay, well, thank you to everybody.